You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, good evening, folks. Happy Wednesday. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that's at ODYSY1.com. You can come on over to Odyssey1.com and check out the entire schedule. You could actually fill your whole day with the 24/7 schedule of radio shows over at Odyssey Radio. So why don't you go take a look, avail yourself of what's there. There's a ton of great programming over there. And you can also join this show tonight, if you'd like, over on my YouTube channel. It's a simulcast of this broadcast in video at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Yesterday, we left off, we were talking about some pretty dark, what would you even call them? I was just going to say things, dark things in our own human history as pertains to the Inquisition and its persecution of anybody who didn't believe the way they believed. And we're going to get back into that in a moment, but I want to mention one thing from something that some people will look at and say, oh, please don't talk about that. That's politics. It's not really. I see this as an historical event. I watched the State of the Union address last night from start to finish. And there's a lot of hullabaloo being made about snubs that were made last night. And for me, this is a point in history that we should all take note of and remember years down the road. I was alive when this stuff happened. But there was a lot being said about Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, tearing up her copy of President Trump's State of the Union address at the end of the event last night. And that is certainly a snub. And frankly, for somebody who's been in the political game since 87, that she first came into office in Congress. So somebody who has made a whole life of being in the political limelight should have known better. But this is how she chooses at pushing 80 to have her legacy established. She tore up the president. Maybe she saw this in her own way as Martin Luther nailing his treatise to the door on the diet of worms. I think it's pretty silly. This was a formal event, and that was her reaction. But then, of course, the reaction from those who defend her action is that the president didn't shake her hand at the beginning. He snubbed her. He simply handed her the document, the congressional document of his speech, and snubbed her by not shaking her extended hand. Well, I want to make a point about that, as the snub goes back even one step further, if you didn't realize this, is that when she announced President Trump, she did not acknowledge him as such. She was continuing to play the political game of the one-sided, Democrat-only, partisan impeachment, and not recognizing Donald Trump as the President of the United States. That is a lack of decorum. I myself, had I been there and somebody snubbed me the way she did that, and by the way, if that was the only thing she had ever done, I could understand there being a problem with snubbing her by not shaking her hand. But this is after 3.5 years of this, and the impeachment hearings in which the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, referred to Trump as a traitor, as a Russian operative, as somebody who bribed, etc., etc., etc. Character assassination after character assassination. I might not have shook her hand either, especially after, on a formal occasion that required decorum, and a bit of formality, that she did not she deliberately did not announce him by use of the proper titles. And I may not have given her my hand either. As a matter of fact, in a different setting, she may have gotten a completely different hand gesture from me. But I think the president showed great restraint in not flipping her the bird. So, last night's events... Oh, and by the way, when he did not shake her hand, he also did not shake Vice President Pence's hand, who was seated right next to Nancy Pelosi, behind him on the podium. So he didn't shake anybody's hand up there. So was that a deliberate snub toward Nancy, or was that a deliberate snub toward Nancy just buried in the fact that he didn't shake anybody's hand last night? So you got snub after snub after snub. And so who is right, who is wrong? I don't think it matters much. But it was an historical event, and it's good for us to get a little perspective in our heads about these kinds of things when we see them. Has it created a distraction? Yeah, sure, to a certain degree. People are talking about that. I think Nancy Pelosi hoped that her action was going to be the main distraction to Trump's overall speech, but that fell very flat. And a couple of real high points last night in that I saw and I thought were very well worth noting was, first of all, when he recognized the 100-year-old Tuskegee Airman, who is the grandfather of a young boy he had in the gallery. And he recognized him and thanked him for his service. And as a gesture, a formality, he, on the spot, promoted this Tuskegee Airman to a brigadier general at age 100. And I thought it was a fantastic gesture. He also, in and amongst all the facts and statistics that he laid out for what he has accomplished and the state of the union right now, he also did something that was very touching. Maybe not so much for those of you who don't like him, but he recognized Rush Limbaugh, who was sitting next to the First Lady, and he awarded him the highest civilian honor, the Congressional Medal of Freedom. And Rush was very viscerally and emotionally moved. And, of course, we all know that Rush has been diagnosed with terminal cancer. And he's doing his best to fight it. In rare occasions, people can come back from something as advanced as his cancer, but we'll see where that all goes. So it was a gesture, and I saw some criticism of that. People saying, he's just a radio host. Why would he deserve that? Well, if you start looking at a list of people who over the decades have received the Congressional Medal of Freedom awarded by the president, they include people like, there was Andrew Wyeth, who was a famous painter, an artist. There was Katharine Hepburn, an actress. Was it Katharine or Audrey Hepburn? I think it was Audrey Hepburn. Rosa Parks. Of course, we would know why she would get a Congressional Medal of Freedom. Elie Wiesel, who a Jewish apologist, a writer, commentator. There were Walt Disney received one. And so, because Rush is just a radio host, would not be why he was awarded that. Rush started what he did about 30 years ago. I remember listening to the, not his first show, but his first year in broadcast in 1988. And he really set the stage for changing the way talk radio was done, political talk radio, and so on. So he was recognized for that. And I think it was a very good thing to do. And, of course, there was so much more. If you didn't get a chance to watch it, it was about an hour and 15 minutes long. Go look it up on YouTube. Watch the State of the Union address, and you're going to get a feel for what President Trump did. And I thought even his detractors in the press, in the mainstream media, have attested that this was probably the finest speech he has ever given, and they said it was a very good speech. So whether you agree with every point along the way, you're going to have your plethora of pundits now picking it apart to see what's factual and what isn't factual. I think it's all factual. They're just going to disagree on the numbers, disagree on the statistics, and so on. So it was a very good speech. If what you take from that, you hear the hullabaloo about the handshake, about the announcement, about the tearing of the document, and so on and so forth, that's just all political gamesmanship as far as I'm concerned. And Trump had every right to not extend her his hand. That's my opinion, my take on it. She, in decrying President Trump as being not worthy of the office and all these other things that have been said about him, she should have known better. And she should have not torn the document. Supposedly, she violated her own set of standards. So there you go. And I'm going to leave that there with you. And we're going to move on in what we're doing with this show tonight. Picking up where we left off last night. I'm going to move off of the whole politic thing. And I want to get back into talking about the brutality of the church. And then I'm going to move it into talking a little bit about the Cathars. I want you to get an idea of who the Cathars were. You may not know. Some of you do. I know there's one listener in particular, Amanda B., whose forebears come from the Cathars. And I know we were in a little private conversation, and she had a fairly emotional response about the Cathars and their mistreatment in the early centuries. So I wanted to hit on this. It really yesterday and the day before, when I was studying and doing a little research to see what I was going to bring to the table when talking about the heresy, the persecution perpetrated by the Inquisition and the early church, and now it's not even the early church anymore. We're talking about up into the Middle Ages now. I did run across the Cathars and wanted to speak to them specifically, but we'll take a little chance to do that tonight. But we'll see how far we get tonight with this and take it from there. And those of you on video, you can see that I have a small child climbing on me right now, and there she is. I've been ignoring her because she knows she's not supposed to come in and interrupt when Dad is on the radio. And you're naked, my young child, so I want you to get down and go out in the other room and let Dad finish his radio show, okay? All right. Don't talk. Don't. I know. They're out there. You just have to look. All right. Sorry again, folks. That's the, I've always said, and I think I said this last week on this show, the beauty of working for myself and officing and studioing in my home is that I'm always around my wife and children. But the absolutely horrid thing about working for myself and having an office and studio in the home is that I'm always around my wife and children. So it is a mixed bag, a grab bag, depending on the day. And the young 5-year-old, who those of you on video just saw, and maybe some of those of you listening on the radio perceived a little disturbance in the force. That one violates all closed doors, knows she's not supposed to be in here when Dad's doing radio, but there she was. So once again, second day in a row, bravo for scintillating live radio. All right, let's move on here. I want to get back into the horrors of the church. And again, as some of you even commented last night, this is pretty bleak stuff. And yeah, it is. But I think it is important for us to really have our memories refreshed about what organized religion can do, especially focusing, for the sake of this study, on what the Christian church did, the Orthodox Christian church did, in its earlier years to its mid-years, and we're not all that far away from what was done then. This is why we stand against religion as being something that governs our countries. You can go worship the way you wish in your own church and keep it there. If it's your lifestyle, you live it the way you want to. But on an official level, especially here in the United States, the government was meant to be secularized, not favoring any one religion. You can call that separation of church and state if you'd like. The founders were for it, by the way, and the church was to be kept at the church, government at the government. You could not rule by religion. And if you look at the literalist Orthodox Church, that took about 2.5 centuries to rise up and formalize after the time of Jesus himself, Christianity turned from being something mystical, mythological in the Gnostic sense, to being something that was literal, and a literal interpretation, a literalist point of view. And that's the way the Orthodox Church began establishing its hierarchy and the way it ruled the people that were the believers beneath it. And the Roman Catholic Church became an intrinsic part of governing in Europe, especially. And when you start seeing the Inquisition, what I want to remind us of by looking at these dark, bleak, heinous chapters in history is that I wanted to state it this way, is that Christianity, if it imposes cruelty and brutality, does not teach the love of Christ. Whether that brutality and cruelty is a mental one, an emotional one, or a physical one, this is not the doings of God. Now, I can only proclaim that because, why would I say because? I think it's because I think we know better, first of all, in our heart of hearts. This is the other day when I talked about we're already awake. It's whether or not we actually appropriate that, whether we actually are aware of being awake. And by being awake, we know that this is not the work of God. And especially not a God that supposedly in the pages of Scripture promotes holiness, promotes love, and the teachings of Jesus certainly promoted this. And so when you get into these later centuries where the church became condemning, the church became heinously brutal, you have a very different picture of what the love of God was supposed to be. Now, let me carry on here. My brain is a little slow today, if you haven't noticed. So bear with me. Keep up with me. It might not be hard to keep up with me tonight because I'm chugging on some low energy tonight, and that's just from being overtired. So don't worry about it. And hopefully you get exactly what I'm saying. And if you don't, come on over to the chat room, pose your questions. Let's talk about it. But at any rate, let me move forward. Yesterday we kind of left off with some of the things that had been done, how in this age of faith, where the priests of the literalist Orthodox Roman Catholic Church were little less than God himself incarnate, a curse from the lips of a priest could condemn somebody. But if a common person accused a priest, he needed 72 witnesses. We went through that a bit last night. During the course, defendants had no right to counsel. They had no right to defend themselves. And they were even denied the right to know who accused them. And by the way, all of this kind of thing, mixed in with many other things, were the reasons a system of jurisprudence such as we have it and enjoy it in the United States today, and in other Western countries where we have a system of jurisprudence where you are innocent until you are proven guilty, not the other way around. That practice is actually a great-great-grandchild, if you will, of these kinds of things that went on in Europe, these kinds of condemnations, these kinds of trials without representation. We saw here that suspicion alone of witchcraft ended up in torture. We saw children were used to testify against their parents, a 2-year-old in one case, 2 years old. The children of those parents murdered were usually forced to beg in vain on the streets, and no one dared feed them or shelter them, and so thus incurring a suspicion of heresy upon themselves. And so the suspicion was sufficient enough to drive away even the closest kindred and friends of the unfortunate. That was the fallout of this. Sympathy for them would have been interpreted as sympathy with their heresy. And that's kind of where we left off last night. The pulley and the strappado, as it was known, was the first torture of the Inquisition that was usually applied to somebody who was accused. Now, mind you, they were not already judged. They were just accused at this point. Executioners would hoist the victims up to the ceiling using a rope with their hands tied securely behind their backs. And they were then suspended about 6 feet from the floor. And in this position, heavy weight irons were put on their legs, usually amounting to about 30 or 40 pounds worth. And it was attached to their ankles. And the executioners would then pull the rope, and then suddenly allowing it to slack caused the victim to fall. But the rapid descent would then come to an abrupt halt before they hit the floor. And it would, as it says here in this account, bewildered every joint and nerve in the system. And in most cases it entailed dislocation. And this process was repeated over and over and over again, heavier and more intense, until the culprit confessed or fell unconscious. Christian monks would stand by to record any confessions, with even records today displaying the transformation of the monks' steady handwriting to vigorous shaking after they recanted inside the dungeons. If a relapsed heretic refused to recant and endure the torture, the contumacious sufferer was then carried to the scaffold and his body bound to a wooden cross. There the executioner with a bar of iron would break each leg and arm in 2 places, and the heretic was left to die. And if they were too slow to expire, the executioner would then partake to strangulation, and their body was bound to a stake and burned outside. And so this is the kind of torture that was given to those who... What was the purpose of these tortures? Was it sedition? Was it murder? Was it... No. It was that they did not believe the same way the official literalist Orthodox Church believed. And for not believing in God the same way or practicing your religion in the same way, these were the kinds of heinous tortures that were inflicted upon people across Europe. I want to look at the persecution of the Waldenses for a minute. At the close of the 12th century, heresy was spreading rapidly in southern France. And by heresy, I mean those who did not want to adhere to the literalist view of the Orthodox Church, that they had a different way they saw worshiping God. And so papal legates were sent by Pope Innocent III into the disaffected districts to increase the severity of repression measures against the Waldenses. In 1200, Peter of Castelnau was made associate, I think I pronounced that right, Castelnau, yep, was made associate inquisitor for southern France. And the powers of the papal legates were increased so as to bring non-compliant bishops within the net. Diego, bishops of Osma, and Dominic came onto the scene, and in 1206 Peter and Raoul went as spies among the Albigenses. And Count Raymond of Toulouse abased himself in 1207 before Peter promised to extirpate the heretics he had defended. Dominic advised a crusade against the Albigenses. The Pope's inquisitors tried, condemned, and punished offenders, inflicting the death penalty itself with the concurrence of civil powers. And I think, by the way, I have run to the end of my time in this first segment. So let's cut out for a break. And I wasn't watching the clock closely, but let's cut out to a break. And we'll come back and we'll pick this up right where we left off. Sit tight. All right, folks, welcome back from that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. ODYSY1.com is the website to go check us out. You can also watch the simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come over and join the rest of the Intrepids in the live chat room and talk about this episode and talk about other things. Great family of people over there. Welcome back, everyone. Now, we left off talking about the Waldenses, or also the Albigenses, and how the Inquisition. I'm only laying these historical facts out so you can see what the church was set about doing. So the Inquisition was destined to become a permanent institution. The vigor, and this is, we're talking, we're in the 13th century here now. To give you a little point of reference, if you think of Braveheart and Robert the Bruce and those characters in Scotland, Edward the First of England, you've got the same time period. So now the Pope's Inquisitions, or his inquisitors, tried, condemned, and punished offenders, inflicting the death penalty itself with the concurrence of civil powers. So all these civil powers across the south of France and other areas all throughout Europe were in concurrence with the church. And why do you think they did this? The politics of the church had grown enormous. It was no longer just a spiritual institution, which perhaps it never was to begin with, although I am sure that there were elements within the church, even the Orthodox Church, that sought true spirituality and a true worship of God. But if you remember, even the Vatican City, became almost a country of its own. The Pope had his own standing army. So this is what the church became. Almost a nation unto itself. Now the Inquisition was also destined to become not just a permanent institution, but something that carried out the brutality of the church against heretics. Now one might say, well, the church really wanted to stop false religion from coming in. Well, that was their point of view, wasn't it? Was that anybody who did not believe the way they believed was promoting a false spirituality, therefore a heresy or even a blasphemy, and the church grew to have power where it can control the people by persecuting those who believed differently. All right? The condemned were to be left in the hands of the secular power, and their goods were to be confiscated. The secular powers were to be admonished and induced, and should it prove necessary, were to be compelled to the utmost of their power to exterminate all who were pointed out as heretics by the church. So the church of God on earth, representing the love of Jesus and the love of God, and the holiness, in their literalist point of view, set about the extermination of anyone who did not believe what they believed. So any prince declining not to purge his land of heresy was to be excommunicated by the church. If he persisted, complaint was made to the Pope, who was then to absolve his vassals from any allegiances and allow the country to be seized by Catholics who should exterminate the heretics. And those who joined in the crusade for the extermination of heretics were to have some indulgence as the crusaders who went to the Holy Land. You can see some of this by, if you remember the story of Henry VIII, the 6 wives of Henry VIII, and when he wanted a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. He needed the approval of the church, and the Pope would not approve it. And so Henry VIII, being powerful enough, withdrew from the church. He was excommunicated, but he started the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And so he just started a new religion, so he could do what he wanted to do. And he didn't fear the Pope too much, but at the beginning, there was great fear of not having the approval of the Pope. And when he didn't get it, he withdrew. So he was a heretic. In the face of this inexpugnable record, how futile is it for the modern church apologists to pretend that Rome did not shed blood and was not responsible for the atrocities of the Inquisition? The Council of Toulouse in 1229 adopted a number of canons tending to give permanent character to the Inquisition as an institution. Excuse me. And it made or indicated the machinery for questioning, convicting, and punishing. Heretics were to be excluded from medical practice. The house in which they were found to be was razed to the ground. They were delivered to the archbishop or local authorities. Forfeiture or public rights could be removed only by a papal dispensation. Anyone who allowed a heretic to remain in his country or who shielded him in the slightest degree would lose his land, personal property, and official position. The local magistracy joined in the search for heretics. Men from ages of 14 and women from 12 were to make oath and renew it every 2 years that they would inform on heretics. This made every person above those ages a bloodhound to track, to torture, and kill. Local councils added to these regulations, always in the direction of severity and injustice. The organic development of papal inquisition proceeded rapidly. The hierarchy of the church was behind all of this. It was found that bishops, for various reasons, would not always enforce the cruel canons of the councils. These bishops sometimes couldn't even go along in their heart of hearts with the papal decrees. So what did Pope Gregory IX do? In August of 1231, he put the Inquisition under the control of the Dominicans, an order especially created for the defense of the church against heresy. Dominican inquisitors were appointed for Aragon, Germany, Austria, Lombardy, and southern France. And the chronicle of the inquisitor Guilhem Pellisso shows the most tragic episodes of a reign of terror which wasted Languedoc in France for a century. Guillaume Arnaud, Peter Sella, Bernard of Caen, Jean Saint Pierre, Nicholas of Abbeville, Folquet de Saint George were all the chief inquisitors who played the part of absolute dictatorship, burning at the stake, attacking both the living and the dead, all under the grant of power of the Pope and the hierarchy of the literalist Orthodox Christian Church. This is the power that they wielded. One of the leading head inquisitors of Germany was Conrad of Marburg. He was very stern in his temperament, and he was narrow-minded. His bigotry was said to be ardent to the pitch of near insanity. Conrad was urged by Pope Gregory IX as to, quote, not to punish the wicked, but as to hurt the innocents with fear, end quote. So don't just punish the wicked, make sure the innocent are branded with fear so they do not become heretics as well. So history shows us how far these inquisitors answered to this ideal. Conrad murdered and terrified countless people in pursuits of his duties, regarding mental and physical torture as rapid route to salvation. He was given full discretionary powers, and he was not required to hear the cases, but to pronounce judgment, which was to be final and without appeal, justice to those suspected of heresy. He didn't have to even hear the case. He was just there to condemn. He was authorized to command the aid of the secular arm, to excommunicate protectors of heresy, and to lay interdict on whole districts. During his reign, he claimed to have uncovered nests of devil worshippers, and he adopted the motto, quote, I would gladly burn 100 innocent if there was one guilty among them. This is the power of the church doing this. I would gladly burn 100 innocents if it would uncover one guilty. So stimulated by this shining example, many Dominicans and Franciscans merged with him and became his eager assistants. He also sentenced the feline cat to be forever viewed as a tool of manifestation for witches and sorcerers. Can you imagine that? He decreed that all feline cats be condemned as tools of Satan, familiars of witches, and so on. Now, during the persecution of heresy in Rhinelands by Conrad, one obstinate culprit actually refused to burn, in spite of all the efforts of his zealous executioners. A thoughtful priest brought to the roasting pile a consecrated host, the communion. This at once dissolved the spell by a mightier magic, and the luckless heretic was speedily reduced to ashes. Other inquisitors included Peter of Verona in Italy, Robert the Bulgar in northeast France, and Bernardus Guidonus in Toulouse. And Guidonus was considered the most experienced inquisitor of his day. He condemned roughly 900 heretics, with recorded sentences pronounced after death against 89 persons during a period of 15 years. Not only was their property confiscated and claimed by the church, and their heirs disinherited, but they were subject to still further penalties. In the north of France, the Inquisition was marked by a series of melancholy events. Robert Le Bourg spent 6 years going through the Nivernais, Burgundy, Flanders, and Champagne, burning at the stake in every place unfortunates whom he condemned without judgment. Then we move on to the Spanish Inquisition. Now, we're not even getting to the Cathars yet. I doubt that we will tonight. If not, we're going to take that up tomorrow. But let's go on, because once again, while some of this seems unnecessary to some, I believe it's a necessary look at the church and what the church did and what it became today. As a matter of fact, there is something that I wanted to look at, which I don't have up in front of me, but they're justifications for the Inquisition through the church. I want you to see some of this. And defense of the Inquisition, justification for the Inquisition. Before we go on even to the Spanish Inquisition, there was justification that was given for this. The Black Legend, the Spanish, La Leyenda Negra, is a style of non-objective historical writing or propaganda that demonstrated and demonized the Spanish Empire, its people and its culture, in an international attempt to damage its reputation. The Black Legend, legend not being meaning story, but meaning like a tallying, a legend. The Black Legend propaganda originated in the 16th century, and it was a time of strong rivalry between European colonial powers. Anti-Spanish sentiments appeared in many parts of Europe as the power of the Spanish Empire grew, and with the Habsburg realm, Spain dominated much of Europe, including present-day Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Italy. Now, in 1555, Pope Paul IV described Spaniards as heretics, schismatics, accursed of God, the offspring of Jews and Marinos, the very scum of the earth. This is the Pope talking about Spaniards. So during the 80 Years' War, English and Dutch propaganda depicted Spaniards as bloodthirsty barbarians, drawing on racial stereotypes that likened them with Arabs. In the following centuries, anti-Spanish stereotypes circulated widely, especially in English, Dutch, German-speaking parts of Europe. This propaganda would depict exaggerated versions of the evil of the Spanish colonial practices and the Spanish Inquisition. In the 18th century, philosopher Immanuel Kant, who never ever went to Spain, stated that this, quote, "The Spaniard's bad side is that he does not learn from foreigners, that he does not travel in order to get acquainted with other nations." Remember, he never traveled to Spain himself. "That he is centuries behind in the sciences. He resists any reform. He is proud of not having to work. He is of a romantic quality of spirit, as the bullfight shows. He is cruel, as the former auto de fe shows." I don't even know what that is. And he displays in his taste an origin that is partly non-European." End quote. Now, historian Walter Italian names, the G's and the N's that are always put together. Mignolo has argued that the Black Legend was closely tied to ideologies of race, both in the way that it used the Moorish history of Spain to depict Spaniards as racially tainted, and in the way that the treatment of Africans and Native Americans during Spanish colonial projects came to symbolize their moral character. The label white legend is used by some historians to describe the historiographic approach that they consider to go too far in trying to counter the black legend, and which consequently ends up painting this uncritical or idealized image of Spanish colonial practices. Such as an approach has been described as characteristic of nationalist Spanish historiography, including the regime of Francisco Franco, which associated itself with the imperial past that was couched in positive terms. Some, such as Benjamin Keane, have been criticized for the works of John Flake and Lewis Hank and so on. That stuff we won't get into this. I'm looking into history here. But the problem is to understand the Inquisition. We have to remember that the Middle Ages were, medieval, okay? We shouldn't expect people in the past to view the world and have their place in it the way we do today. That's a big mistake we make when looking at past events. We have to understand the Inquisition from its context in the Middle Ages. Try living through the Black Death and see how it changes your attitude. For people who lived during those times, religion was not something that one just did at church on Sunday. It was science. It was philosophy. It was politics. It was identity and hope for salvation. It wasn't just a personal preference, but an abiding and universal truth. Heresy, then, struck at the heart of that truth for the common people. And obviously the hierarchy of the literalist church. It doomed the heretic, endangered those near him, and tore apart the entire fabric of community. The Inquisition was not born out of a desire to crush diversity or oppress people. It was rather an attempt to stop unjust executions. Now, keep in mind, this is the justification by the church for the Inquisition. It's not what I believe was right and true. This is what they believe about themselves. This is where we started when I entered this little historical repartee here. The Inquisition was born out of a desire to crush diversity or oppress people. That was a false notion, according to the Roman Catholic Church today, in their attempts to justify the Inquisition. It was rather an attempt to stop unjust executions. And yeah, you read that correctly. You have to take into account that the church now is attempting to justify actions then. And that's exactly what they were doing. And this is how they were justifying it. Heresy was a crime against the state. Roman law and the Code of Justinian made it a capital offense. Rulers whose authority was believed to come from God had no patience for heretics. Neither did common people, who saw them as dangerous outsiders who would bring down the divine wrath. When someone was accused of heresy in the early Middle Ages, they were brought to the local lord for judgment, just as if they'd stolen a pig or damaged shrubbery. Really, that was a serious crime in England, by the way. Yet in contrast to those crimes, it was not so easy to discern whether the accused was really a heretic. For starters, one needed some basic theological training. something most medieval lords sorely lacked, and the common people really did not have: theological training. So the result is that uncounted thousands across Europe were executed by secular authorities without fair trials or a competent assessment of the validity of the charge. The Catholic Church's response to this problem was the Inquisition. First instituted by Pope Lucius in 1184, it was born out of a need to provide fair trials for accused heretics using laws of evidence and presided over by knowledgeable judges. And so from the perspective of secular authorities, heretics were traitors to God and the king, and therefore deserved to die. And from the perspective of the church, however, in their justification of the Inquisition, heretics were lost sheep who had strayed from the flock. And as shepherds, the Pope, the bishops, had a duty to bring them back into the fold, just as the Good Shepherd had commanded them to do. So, while medieval secular leaders were trying to safeguard their kingdoms, the church was trying to save souls via the Inquisition. And the Inquisition provided a means for heretics to escape death and return to the community. And for those interested, here is Madden on the Spanish Inquisition. Again, many terrible things were done by the medieval church under the banner of the Inquisition, but very often many more terrible things were done by the medieval Europeans away from that banner. And on the more than one occasion, the terror stopped when the inquisitors arrived, according to the church. One might argue that at least some of the principles valued by the Inquisitions, the need for a fair trial, the deployment of reason to determine the facts, the recognition that every soul has value, the rejection of mob rule and arbitrary punishment, are in harmony with the Enlightenment rather than at war with it. Now, this is the way the Catholic Church today justifies the Inquisition. That it was all about saving souls, they said. Now, we've only got a few minutes left here, and I wanted to cover the Spanish Inquisition and the Roman Inquisition and talk about what they did. I've got so much material on this, and I don't really necessarily want to carry this over into another night, but because tomorrow I want to hit the Cathars, and I want to talk about who the Cathars were historically, and the atrocities committed against them, and where they ended up. But tonight, let's kind of wrap this with, let's just hit on Spanish and Roman Inquisitions very quickly. The Spanish Inquisition was established in 1478 with the approval of Pope Sixtus IV. The reform and extension of the ancient tribunal, which had existed from the 13th century, was mainly to discover and eliminate Jews and Muslims, secretly taking up their beliefs in private. And the conduct of this holy office greatly weakened the power and diminished the population of Spain. The Roman Inquisition. In the early 1500s and the 1600s, the Catholic Church went through a reformation. It consisted of two related movements. One, the defensive reaction against the Reformation, a movement begun by Martin Luther in 1517 that gave birth to Protestantism. And two, a Catholic reform which saw Protestants declare war on Catholics. So now the Roman Catholic Church called the Council of Trent partly as a defense against Protestantism, and on it goes. There was a censorship of books by the Roman Catholic Church, complete condemnation and suppression, the expunging of certain objectionable passages or parts, and the correction of sentences, or the deletion of specific words as mentioned. And so all of this went on. And to kind of wrap this all up, Victor Hugo, he was the author of The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He estimated the number of victims of the Inquisition at 5 million people. It said, and certainly the number was much greater than that if we take into account, as we should, the wives, the husbands, the parents, the children, the brothers, the sisters, the other relatives of those who were tortured and slaughtered by priestly institutions. In these millions, to these millions should be properly added the others killed in the wars precipitated in the attempt to fasten the Inquisition upon the people of various countries, as the Netherlands and Germany. So there you have it, folks. And I think we might even be close to being over time, so I've got to kind of cut it off abruptly there. But tomorrow, we're going to hit a little bit more of this from a different perspective. Thanks for sitting through this bleak recitation of a very dark period of church history. More where that came from. Have a good night.